Thank you for your attention. My name is Martin Kenny. I live in the BVI. I'm a fraud and asset recovery lawyer, and sitting next to me is investigator Kim Marsh. He lives in London, and he's with an investigation firm called IPSA International. Welcome. We are going to now present to the next 55 minutes an interesting story, a tale called Gaddafi's Libya, inside a covert operation to seek to recover $240 million of stolen cash in 12 steel boxes, shrink-wrapped U.S. $100 notes. We start with a little bit of background. The brotherly leader and guide of the revolution of the Republic of Libya ran Libya as its dictator as a result of a coup d'etat when he was a colonel in the army, from 1969 until 2011. You might recall that in early 2011, there was a revolution that took hold that began the so-called Arab Spring in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. And by the spring of 2011, the modern revolution, as it's called, in Libya took root. And by October the 20th of that year, Colonel Gaddafi had met his demise at the hands of some of his people. It is also a well-known fact, as published by the World Bank's STAR initiative, that's the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, and other authorities, as it's also widely accepted, that when it comes time for a dictator to conclude his moment with the hands on the tiller of power of his nation, that he begins to prepare for an exit stage left. Gaddafi had instructed his confidant and head of intelligence services in Libya to arrange for steel boxes containing cash, literally U.S. $100 notes, in the central bank of Libya, in Tripoli, to be removed and placed on various trucks and moved southward bound into Chad and other neighboring countries to Libya during the course of the summer months of 2011. It's also known that the head of intelligence arranged for some of this money to head towards French West Africa. And we move now to the jurisdiction known as Ivory Coast. $240 million of the cash reportedly was transported to certain asset controllers, former senior members of the Ivory Coast Armed Forces, entrusted with the funds for and on behalf of Mr. Gaddafi, ultimately. And of course, the immediate boss of the funds was the intelligence chief who had entrusted them with these people that he trusted. After Gaddafi was killed in October of 2011, the intelligence chief had fled Libya and was caught a number of months later in Chad and extradited to stand trial for his crimes against the Libyan people in Tripoli. So now the scenario is that the cash that had been stolen or spirited away in the final days of the regime and placed in places unknown throughout West Africa, the boss of the cash was no longer present. He was gone. He was either dead in the case of Gaddafi or now in jail in the case of his intelligence chief. That's the setting and the background. Another bit of background is in the spring of 2013, the World Bank's STAR initiative asked me to go to Cairo, Egypt, to help train senior anti-corruption officials on asset tracing, MLAT writing, and other investigative techniques to assist the team there in investigating the assets of Mr. Mubarak and his family and cronies. The STAR initiative was set up by the World Bank approximately 8 or 9 years ago to provide technical training and assistance to developing nations victimized by kleptocracies and dictators who remove value. In the case of Gaddafi, it was quite an important case in dealing with stolen assets for a sovereign, and because his regime had lasted 42 years, and the regime had control of massive retained earnings, to wit, profits generated from oil trades. So Libya was it's an oil producer, produced 2 or 3% of the world's oil during this period of time, and some reports suggest as much as $160 billion of retained earnings from these oil trades were spirited away and located in various financial institutions around the world. So in terms of the global picture of assets stolen from Libya, the broad picture is about half of that dark number, the hypothetical number based on what economists think may have been stolen. About half appears to be have been invested formally in the investment in the sovereign fund of Libya, which most of that value was frozen in New York and London and other Western banks when Gaddafi perished, and has been or will be recovered for the Libyan people. Then there's a dark number that no one is certain about its measure of value. It could be as much as another $80 billion. And a small portion of that is represented by the cash that is accepted that was spirited away in the final days of the regime. And what we're going to talk about is one little strand of that, $240 million of literally cash in steel boxes. Now, next step in our narrative. Investigator Kim Marsh served 25 years in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police from 1973 to 1998. Investigator Marsh was in charge in Ottawa between 83 and 88 of the Mounties' national undercover program, specifically targeting narcotics conspiracies to import cocaine and other controlled substances into our homeland, Canada. For a time, Kim was seconded between 1988 and 1992 to this city, Miami, to work closely with the Drug Enforcement Agency of this country, because many conspiracies to import controlled substances to Canada involve passage through the United States. In Kim's tradecraft, he would develop sources and agents. Agents would be one step further than a source, a confidential informant. A source might be someone suspected or charged with an offense who could be turned in exchange for years of liberty. So instead of perhaps going to jail in America for 20 years, a man might be turned into an agent or informant and buy his way out of jail after serving only 2 years. And this was a successful technique or measure used by law enforcement to combat drugs under the Reagan administration, the war on drugs that happened in this country in the 1980s. So one of the agents that Kim recruited, whose recruitment resulted in the end of 2 conspiracies where 5 to 10 men went to jail for a very long time from Colombia, was a man called Craig. Craig was a Canadian, a fellow Canadian, who was also a criminal. Kim had not heard from Craig for 20 years. And in March of 2013, this former agent of Kim's, now Kim is being out of the public sector for how many years at this point last year? 15 years. 15 years, in the private sector as a private investigator. But it's also important to note that when law enforcement officials develop relationships with agents like this or sources, there's what is created usually is a close relationship of trust. And Craig trusted Kim. Craig was introduced, according to him, to a situation. The situation was introduced by another colleague, retired criminal named Murray, another fellow Canadian living in Bangkok, Thailand. Murray reported to Craig, and we'll call these men sources. The sources had information from the cousin to a former brigadier general in the Sudanese army, and the cousin was employed by an African embassy in Bangkok. The cousin, whose name we'll call Mohammed, reported to Craig and another informant called Simon, who's from Australia, that some of Gaddafi's cash had been entrusted to former senior officers in the Ivory Coast Armed Forces who were close and friendly to this brigadier general from the Sudanese army, cousin to Mohammed. So there you go. You have asset controllers purportedly left to their own devices with a small fragment of stolen monies from Gaddafi's regime, situate in Abidjan, the capital city of Ivory Coast, as reported by these informants. Now, what was the scenario? Mohammed reported to informants Simon and Murray, and then through Craig to Kim Marsh, investigator Marsh, that the asset controllers left to their own devices were scratching their heads wondering how on earth do we move or transport this value out of Ivory Coast, because if we try and deposit it into a bank here, it will be taken from us for obvious reasons. And how do we get it out of Ivory Coast to a safe haven, a Western nation or two or three, to blend, integrate, fragment, layer, these are all the words we use in money laundering typologies, the value in order that they could take pleasure and use and enjoyment of it and move away from Ivory Coast. So the scenario was they were looking for someone who had experience in money laundering investigations and knew the world's banking systems. So through this relationship of trust built many years ago between Craig and Kim, began this scenario and investigation. Kim, you called me, and what did you say?
Just a little bit more information. As Martin alluded to, I hadn't spoken to Craig for 20 years, and I had moved out of law enforcement in 1998. But I'm easy enough to find. Just Google me, and that's what he did, and he sent me an email. I was slightly surprised by the contact, as you would expect, and didn't know what to make of it in the beginning. But I had worked some very successful cases with Craig when I was here, 88 to 92. He was always accurate with his information. I knew he wasn't a person to exaggerate, and so that's why I gave him the attention that we eventually did. In the beginning, it was a phone introduction, and that's when the Australian fellow came on the phone. I didn't know about him in the beginning.
Simon.
Simon, and we had some dialogue, and then I told them, well, they have to follow up with an email. Murray is an aging career criminal. He's not very good technically, so he brought Simon into the scenario because he had those skill sets that would allow communication and to deal with a number of the things that Murray wasn't able to do. Just a little bit about undercover. This is not an undercover course we're on here, but it is a very effective way of investigating. It's before, during, and after the fact technique. Before the fact, you talk to somebody who wants to get their husband shot, and you're an undercover operator. That's before the fact. During the fact, you buy drugs, and the offense is happening right there. You're involved with it. After the fact is when you get somebody to talk about some of the activities that they've done. And I've been able to use it effectively, but on a very selective basis in the private sector. In 15 years, I've probably worked 10 good ones. And out of those, just a couple real quick ones. One time, an executive from a big tobacco company involved in smuggling tobacco back into Canada from the U.S., befriended him on a plane ride. I managed to get in a business seat beside him on a transatlantic flight, and I befriended him. And I was able to convince him through dialogue that I was somebody that could possibly help him. But you have to realize there's a lot of investigation that happens before you get in that seat. And on that one, we got lucky with surveillance and trash pulls, all legal stuff. And we were able to determine he was going to be traveling, and so then we had to work, and you need a bit of luck to get in the seat beside him. On another occasion, and I don't want to digress too far, but on another occasion we got down and saw an accountant in Costa Rica, and the accountant had hidden a bunch of assets for somebody who had a judgment against them. And we managed, after research, to learn that he was in a real estate project, and we befriended him. And the fellow that I brought in on that one has a lot of expertise in dealing with financial undercover operations, and we'll talk about him at the end of this session. So we have used it successfully. The Costa Rican accountant introduced me to his banker and his lawyer, and he told us exactly how to hide the assets, which is exactly the way he did it for his other client that we were pursuing. As you would imagine, this was a high-risk investigation. I'm not law enforcement any longer. I could be involved with handling stolen goods, which is an offense in itself. I'm going to be into a foreign jurisdiction where there's a little rule of law. I'm obviously dealing with some serious criminals, people that are involved with $240 million, so we believed, and so there was a necessity to do it exactly right and bring in the expertise that Martin has. The things that I was concerned about, first, is the information accurate? You have to assess the information. Any good investigator does that. Was it a rip of some kind? Was I the victim here? And were they going to rip me? Were they going to lock us up perhaps down there and we get into a kidnap situation? Was the money counterfeit? You know, we've all heard about stories where people get paid and the money's almost worthless because it's counterfeit. And was it a West African fraud of some kind? On the first trip...
So just to go, before we go to the first trip in the field to Bangkok by investigator Kim, Investigator Marsh called me in, as I recall, late March or early April of last year and described this scenario to me. And he said, IPSA would like to have some legal advice from MKS, from Martin Kenny and co-solicitors, about this scenario. What should we do? And I issued a written opinion and said, well, as I've outlined in my introductory remarks, it's widely known that these monies are out there. Whether this money actually exists in the hands of the people purporting to control it, and whether it can be attributed with evidence to Libya, these are questions unknown. However, because of my relationship as a senior trainer with STAR of the World Bank, the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, I know the people well at STAR, and a part of their brief is to help client nations in Arab Spring countries and other developing nations with these kinds of investigations. So I advised IPSA that we had to immediately go to STAR with the scenario and seek their advice and recommendations in terms of presenting the scenario once verified, once we'd had done some more field investigation to satisfy ourselves that the money existed, that it wasn't counterfeit, and that it seemed to be attributable to Libya, that we could then seek a mandate under a contract by the so-called Asset Recovery and Tracing Commission for the new fledgling government of Libya through the offices of the World Bank STAR Initiative. I contacted STAR. They appreciated the facts. They understood the sensitivity of the facts and the risks. They actually were organizing a workshop and training session for Libya in London at the time of the contact or soon thereafter, and suggested that we appear in London, meet with the authorities, and seek the mandate there. I said, no. I said we need to do more work before we would be prepared to present the scenario to the prospective victim state client. So this then led to my advice that Kim get in an airplane, go to Bangkok, meet the informants, meet Mohammed, the middleman, and begin to test the story.
So the first trip, I was contacted, I think Martin said, in March of 2013, and it was at least 6-8 weeks later that I got to Bangkok. And of course, I'm going to assess Murray and Simon, and I asked that I be introduced in a covert manner to Mohammed. Mohammed was a Sudanese national working for another country's embassy, and they had known him for a couple of years. Just a little bit more information. I mean, one of the reasons they came to me is they've been talking to Mohammed for quite some time about this asset, and they didn't have the wherewithal or the contacts to progress the matter. And so that's when Murray, talking to his criminal buddy Craig, said, listen, I think I know a guy who might be able to help, and that's how I came into it. I wanted to assess them. I did, and then I thought, okay, let's go meet Mohammed. And we were introduced to him just outside the embassy. He brought the secure phone with him on that meeting. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And I started getting the information about, how do you know about this asset? He said to me that his cousin, retired brigadier general, we've heard about that a little bit already, and knows these individuals. They all went to military school somewhere together, and this asset had made its way down to Ivory Coast. This information didn't all come out at one time, but eventually we realized there was the one stash in Abidjan and Ivory Coast, close to the airport. It was $240 million US, we were told. So I gave very clear instructions to Mohammed. I led him to believe that I had the capability, and Murray had set this stage before I came in, of course, that I knew people who could get the money into the system and eventually get it back to them. And we could set up accounts, we could do a number of things. I also had the wherewithal, knew the proper people who could transport it out. They wanted it transported out in bulk. And we were telling them that we would most likely do that via plane, but before we even started talking about that, we needed to see the money. And when Mohammed he was the first fellow to go down. He was going to go down on his own. He felt completely comfortable with it. When Mohammed went down, I gave him clear instructions to get a photograph with a current newspaper, look at the asset, glean as much information as you can, and if they'll allow it, bring some samples home. And if they don't allow it, then we've got a big red flag. Why are they not allowing us to have samples of this money? Then it's looking like counterfeit. We sent him down, and that was, he went down late July. He actually saw the asset, I believe it was
August 2nd.
August 2nd.
Yep.
And it went pretty well. They took him to a location by the Abidjan airport, a bonded warehouse. They brought in a steel box.
Two cardboard boxes with steel boxes contained in them, I say.
Yeah.
When I look at the photographic evidence. Why don't we start
we'll get into...
Now, before we move from this photo, on the bottom right-hand corner is a shipping manifest. And I cannot, my memory is not clear today what false entries were in the shipping manifest for the boxes in question, but they were certainly, they did not disclose in the customs shipping papers that there was cash in the boxes.
It was gems, yeah.
Gems, gemstones. So we had false customs declarations indicating the men in control of whatever the asset was were presenting us with evidence that they had lied to the local authorities in this customs bonded warehouse about what was contained in these boxes. Now, the other thing that's a particular moment is if you turn your eyes to the photograph at the bottom, in the middle, you'll see an upside-down seal of some kind. Now, if you were to reverse that photograph and put it right, you'll see a hawk, and the hawk's head is turned to the left. Uniquely in all of the Arab world, the symbol of a hawk is an honored symbol in Islam and in the Arab world. But always when you see the hawk on national symbols or national flags, like in Egypt, I think they have a hawk, the hawk's head is turned to the right. In 1976, for reasons unknown to me, Colonel Gaddafi introduced this as a new seal for his republic, where the hawk's head is turned to the left. Also, anyone doing research on the seal would note that the colors are correct, and if you bring the photograph up so that it is very vivid, you would conclude, as an expert helped us to conclude, that this in fact was an authentic replication of the Great Seal of Libya. Also, you'll see some beginnings, and some further photographic evidence in a moment will reveal the white tape, sealing tape, with some red print on it. That print is in Arabic, and when a translator helped us to discern its writing, the words are, quote, Central Bank of Libya. So now the photo on the top right is inside the bonded warehouse with, do we recall the name of the gentleman in the photograph?
He was referred to as Haji Mohammed. So Haji is anybody who's been to Mecca, and Mohammed is a lot of people. So, but we were told it was Haji Mohammed, and he was a Mali national, and he was a former diplomat in Tripoli. And his responsibility was to deal with the asset as instructed by the people who had stolen it.
We also had asked to be given information about the weight of these boxes, and the weight was given, and we checked with the Federal Reserve through the Secret Service about the weight. What does it weigh? What is a steel box? And by the way, these are standard steel boxes used by central banks in terms of their dimensions. That if you put $20 million of US $100 notes in a steel box that's of a uniform size, the weight is approximately the same. And as it happens, the report that we got back from the weight was very specific and very accurate, and checked with what the Federal Reserve told us the weight of a steel box containing $20 million of US $100 notes would equal. So why don't we move on to the next photograph?
Yeah, just to finish off, the top two left pictures, that's Abidjan. And then the bonded warehouse where you see the gentleman in the top right, and Martin has explained the others.
Now, these are more close-ups. You can see, you have a better shot at the Arabic lettered sealing tape over the seals in the boxes, and a better picture of the actual writing in the Great Seal of Libya, which, as I say, we verified with an expert. Why don't we move to the next photo? Boxes open, cash produced. Mohammed was afforded the opportunity, because it was a condition of the inspection being performed, that we be permitted to pull out, through Mohammed, some specimen notes to verify whether they were counterfeit, forgeries, or real notes. And he did so. He pulled out 5 specimen notes. Now, you'll see he was also permitted, there's tape over the shrink-wrap notes, and underneath the tape were stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of notes. And Mohammed was permitted to see that there was not sort of a false bottom, or that you're just looking at the surface of a few notes. He was able to see that the boxes contain nothing but notes. We also asked Mohammed to take the day's newspaper in the French language in Abidjan, which I think was Saturday, August 2nd, if memory serves, to photograph some of the specimen notes that he'd pulled from the box against the newspaper. So we could see, because we weren't present, and none of Mohammed, it's important to note, was in the middle. He was not advised by us that this was a preliminary inquiry leading up to what could be a sting operation for Libya to recover this value. So we had taken, I guess, Craig, Murray, and Simon as informants into our confidence about that we would not be involved with any criminal activity, obviously, that we would only be involved if we had a lawful mandate to recover an asset that we were convinced belonged to the people of Libya, from Libya, and that we were in this preliminary stage to verify what was actually the truth or not the truth. And I was concerned that we have some verification that the photographic evidence was actually relevant to the temporal quality of the time of the inspection. So that's the reason for the newspaper. Also, I would note that those 4 notes are sequentially numbered in 2 pairs. So the 2 notes at the left are sequentially numbered, as are the 2 notes on the right, but different sequences.
So I went to debrief. Now let me back up. After the visit to Abidjan by Mohammed, he stopped in Khartoum on the way home. His mother lived there, he had family members there, and also his cousin, retired Brigadier General, lived there at that time. And but he did, as instructed, send the notes to me in the UK. And I'm a little bit confused on this one. Sorry. We did get the information, the photographs on the notes, and we got a report from him that was actually put together by Simon. Simon being the technical one of the group.
In Bangkok upon debriefing Mohammed.
Yeah, and he sent the report with me with his photographs, some of the photographs you see here, and we had the information on the bills, but we didn't actually have the bills.
Except for one was sent to us, the 5th note was sent to us in its original form.
I got that when I went to Bangkok on the next trip.
Okay.
Yeah. So I sent that information through the World Bank to the U.S. Secret Service. They have the mandate to investigate U.S. currency matters. And originally it came back counterfeit. The money was not legitimate. But they didn't have the actual bills. They only had what I just described. And we didn't get a lot more information at that time. We put our heads together.
I think the conclusion initially was tentative. It wasn't conclusive because they didn't have the original notes, and they said provisionally, we think they may be counterfeit.
Yeah, that's right. We got a written response that the World Bank got a written response, said counterfeit, but there was a verbal report as well. So there was some gray area there. And we wanted to get the originals, though, and I wanted to properly debrief Mohammed. So we put our heads together, back to Bangkok I go and meet Mohammed again in a covert manner. But before I met Mohammed, Simon and Murray come to me sheepishly, and they've only got 1 bill. What did Mohammed do? I mean, there's always the old saying, no cases, no problems, little cases, little problems, big cases, big problems. And this certainly was one of those situations. He had sent 2 through a money service business to a friend that wanted $200, and he, on the way home, had given 2 of the $100 bills to his mother, and he brought 1 back. And so that's what I got from Simon and Murray. And Mohammed was saying, well, I didn't know you actually wanted the bills. I just thought you just wanted the photographs. So I did get 1, and I debriefed him, and that's when I asked him a lot of questions, of course, as you do. Who's the boss there? And he told me the Malay guy's the boss, the guy you saw on the top right. And I asked him how it went down. I got as much detail as I possibly could without spooking him. And I told him, then we told him at that time that we have to still verify the bills. You know, you only brought 1 original home. And I told Murray and Simon about the counterfeit first report we got, but we didn't tell Mohammed. So then kind of ties up that trip.
We went back to the Secret Service, and they did more work on the specimens. they had a more senior expert inspect the photographic evidence of 4 of the notes, the sequential numbers, and the 5th one where we had an actual original specimen. The report came back dramatically differently. This more senior agent who gave a formal report to the World Bank indicated it was his conclusion that there was 100% certainty that the 5th note was genuine, and about a 98% certainty, because he was looking at photographs and not at originals, 98+% probability that the other 4 notes were also genuine. Which is another interesting side tale, that even the U.S. Secret Service, when asked to look at notes informally, may get it wrong. And there was a long explanation for why that happened, and it had to do with their own Federal Reserve System and the way the numbering system is sequenced, and how deeply they have to do research in order to actually reach a conclusion. So that's an important, if you're working with cash and counterfeit potential money, don't take the first opinion you get from the Secret Service. You need to drill down and make sure that that there's a thorough investigation inside their system as to whether notes are authentic or not, because this is obviously crucial in this investigation.
And we got another piece of information that was perplexing.
To say the least.
The bills left the Fed Bank, U.S. Fed Bank.
No, the Federal Reserve of New York. They were transported. When the Federal Reserve of New York moves money around into the system outside of America, there are only 2 or 3 banks in the world now who will receive the value and then transport it into the larger system of payments, of cash payments. One of these banks was located in Zurich. The bank in Zurich received from the New York Federal Reserve by a secured air transport a very large shipment of U.S. $100 notes on March the 16th, 2013. 4 of the notes, the sequentially numbered ones, were contained in that shipment. The 5th note, the original one that we had, was also delivered by the U.S. Federal Reserve to the same money center bank in Zurich in another big shipment of U.S. dollar notes, and received on July 17th, 2013. Colonel Gaddafi was killed on October 20, 2011. So we have now a puzzle, a riddle. How do 5 specimen notes in 2 boxes containing 40 million US dollars of cash, how are those randomly selected notes created by the US Treasury and delivered into the system at first instance, if the system is Zurich, and then find their way into some boxes in the Ivory Coast, in Abidjan? In one case, 4 months duration in the time capsule, another case 2 weeks between July 17 and August 2nd when the inspection was going on. So we immediately thought, well, this is not money that comes from Gaddafi's regime, but it does belong to someone, and it is a lot of money, and there are criminals holding it, and we need to find out what the story is.
We got a lot of other good intel from through the World Bank. The way it was boxed was exactly the same as what we had seen in that warehouse. The U.S. Federal Reserve only sends out U.S. $100 bills. And Martin's already alluded to the fact that it goes from there to Switzerland, and then this other entity, we don't want to name these entities, provide bulk cash to African central banks and others. So it made sense, but the timeline was off. So I returned to, we decided to take it another step. We, as Martin's already said, we knew we had real cash, and we felt we had a victim, that this money was being ripped off, it was being diverted. We had lots of theories about it, but we didn't have the full picture. And so back I went to Thailand for the 3rd trip, and then I brought in another individual to help me with it. And he was a former Mountie colleague who did a lot of very high-level financial undercover investigations. He was the guy I told you about when I went down to Costa Rica. He came down with me to Costa Rica. He's currently working for an investment bank in Hong Kong. He's, like me, long left law enforcement.
But unlike you and undercover with narcotics, he was specialist undercover money laundering.
Money laundering, financial crimes. That's right. Some of you may remember Bermuda Short.
So in other words, he had acted in a performance as secretly as a law enforcement officer, pretending to be a professional, corrupt, bent money laundering banker. Bill the banker, we call him.
Yeah, Bill the banker. And just a quick note, Bermuda Short was an investigation out of here, 2 years, where he worked with the FBI. They ended up locking up, you may not remember this, Martin Chambers. Martin Chambers is a Cambridge-educated lawyer who had gone bad years ago, and he got some very significant, smart people. He knows the business. So I brought him in on the next scenario, and the instructions on the next scenario was to verify, verify, verify. And one other thing that the Australian fellow brought to the picture was he was a former air freight person. He had, in one of his previous lives, he had handled air freight. He had quite a bit of specific knowledge that would help with the process on the transportation end. And they went down again. I told them, we want to see the full 240 million if they've got it. And they're saying all along on the secure phone that Mohammed always has with him, because embassy people have secure phones, that's not a problem, and please bring your people down. They're telling us we're starting to talk more now about moving the money, and our plan was to. And meantime, also, when I'm back in the UK, I'm talking to former British servicemen who are in the private sector about what we need for assets to get down there to pick this up. And our general plan was to bring it back to Malta. One plane ride without stopping anywhere was possible, and our plan was to bring it into Malta and then secure it there.
Well, after we found a victim, and after we had a mandate, and after I was able to answer Dan Wise's question in my litigation section, even if we had a client, and even if we had a mandate, and even if Investigator Marsh had a fairly satisfactory secured way of uplifting the assets outside of the country, would we be violating the local laws of that country in some way? We had debates about, well, we probably could be committing some customs offenses, because you don't get to usually leave West Africa with $240 million of cash without violating a law unless you declare you change gemstones to what is actually in the boxes. We debated whether we could take the money to the U.S. Embassy in Abidjan or the British Embassy, and in an arrangement made with those governments or one of them to now move the value into the sovereign space of one of the leading nations in the world, to have them in a diplomatic pouch move the value out without breaking the law. So we had a serious legal issues in any respect of what we were going to do. So again, we were just gathering facts at this time, not committing offenses, trying to figure out what the truth was.
So we're going to break the team up. The Australian and Mohammed were going to be looking at the asset, and their mission was to verify. And I gave them, as I said before, very specific instructions on what I needed to see to satisfy myself, and I told him I had investors in this. I think Martin was talking about investments in his session this morning. Well, I was saying the same thing. I had investors, and it's my responsibility to make sure that the investors' money is not squandered. They got that. They went down ahead, a couple of days ahead of Bill. Bill, by chance, had been dealing with a gentleman from that part of Africa. We got him in there because everybody's going in on visas, and you're disclosing your true identity information. These people were all government people. They were military. They would have access to any and all information that the government might have, including visas, who's coming in from Hong Kong. So we were walking a tightrope for sure. But Bill got in there on a visa on another, for another reason. And we had a very specific plan. The other side didn't know the plan, but Bill and I had a specific plan on what he would do and wouldn't do as far as steps and meeting these targets. The asset controllers, the targets, they always knew where Mohammed and Simon were, and they had a number of meetings with them, and eventually they did get to see the asset. And we were not going to bring Bill out until we had this verification step completed. And at the end, then Bill met, just one completion, met Captain Adam, who showed up in a high-end Mercedes with one of his cohorts. And we had a meeting in a hotel lobby.
And what's significant about that meeting, firstly, was that it took place in this hotel lobby, and Banker Bill, former RCMP investigator of prominence, with a distinguished record, is a keen observer of things. He noticed that across the street from the entrance to his hotel were the side entrances to the central bank of Abidjan, of the Republic of Ivory Coast, located in the capital city. And there were specific security guards armed outside the central bank with specific uniforms, emblazoned, festooned, specific to the central bank. And he took note of this, and its relevance will become apparent in a few minutes.
And one of the things that Mohammed had told me when I went to debrief him on the second trip to Bangkok is that the money, when he was shown to him, there was 3 uniformed guards that came with the money. Said nothing, stood there. So we have exactly the way the U.S. Secret Service described it. It's going to be shrink wrapped with paper on the next layer, and then the steel box, and it's strapping around it.
It's sitting on a wooden pallet. 4 boxes, $20 million a box, $80 million of cash.
So we got the guard in the top right-hand corner, and we've got a couple of people there that were connected to the bonded warehouse. And we got Captain Adam in the top left. We were never able to properly identify him. Adam is a first name, and he obviously had a surname. Adam's not a very African name from that part of the world. And we were not able to properly identify him. We had, of course, as you do when you're investigating, did a lot of research and work up on the people that we were meeting as much as we possibly could. We got to see 4 boxes rather, 80 million. We didn't get to see the full 240. They started to ask about seeing the boxes on the Friday. We got to see it late Monday afternoon. We were not able to see it until then.
Again, the same sealing tape, Central Bank of Libya, the same Great Seal of Libya, shrink-wrapped notes. In all respects that we could verify, they appear to be authentic, and we were given 6 random specimens this time, 6 notes to inspect.
And Simon took a lot of photographs. We were shown the notes in exactly the same location as the first viewing, same bonded warehouse. Some of the same people were there. Haji Mohammed wasn't there, and Captain Adam had taken over, which told me that probably Haji was not really in charge of the control of the assets. It was probably Captain Adam. But maybe Haji had some access to the Libyans, if in fact that was the case. Then we had red flags. We assessed the situation, and these are the red flags.
The timeline of delivery of the specimen notes by the New York Federal Reserve to Zurich. Do you recall the first 4 notes on inspection number 1, August 2nd of last year, were delivered by the New York Federal Reserve to Zurich to a specific bank in March of last year, and the 5th note in July, 2 weeks before the first inspection. The 6 other notes that derive from inspection number 2 in the first week of October, they equally had been delivered by the New York Federal Reserve to the same bank in Zurich during the same time capsule, March to July of last year. So they, again, could not have possibly derived from Gaddafi's Libya. The story behind the funds, when we started comparing notes, was inconsistent. There was in the during the first inspection with Mohammed an upfront fee request. Well, we have the bonded warehouseman. He has falsified customs records, and he requires to be paid a $1.5 million fee in exchange for his participation in this crime. And Kim quite rightfully let the response being, well, just open up one of the boxes and pull out $1.5 million and pay the warehouseman his fee. Why do you need it from us? You're trying to retain our services to launder cash for you. What are you talking about? So we brushed that one aside, but of course we were always cognizant of that request. Timing on the second viewing, guards accompanying the funds, and if we had photographic evidence, I think if we went back to the photograph of I guess it's not shown in the photograph that we just posted, but in the evidence we had assembled, it was very clear that the armed guard present in the photograph, according to Banker Bill, wore the identical uniform of the same security guards armed, guarding the central bank of Ivory Coast.
We confirmed that with research as well. We went back and took a photograph of the guards around the central bank. It was exactly the same uniform. And you remember that Mohammed said there was 3 guards that came with the money in the first go-around.
Timing of the second viewing, the guards accompanying the funds, lack of concern on how their share of the proceeds. They had proposed that the laundrymen, Bill the banker, would earn a 40% success fee for successfully laundering the money, and they would then have 60% of the value reposed somewhere hidden in the West. But they did not, when upon interview, Banker Bill, who's obviously an astute undercover operative, he took cognizance of the fact that that Captain Adam really wasn't interested in the detail, the methodologies, the typologies of the laundering process, which was surprising. They seemed to do a lack of due diligence on our own team. And finally, psychological profile of lying. When policemen who are trained to interview subjects are also trained on certain signals, body language, we communicate, some psychologists say, 20% in words, 80% in body language. And if, when asked a question like, did this money come from Libya? And the subject, Captain Adam, is not looking in your eyes, stops giving eye contact, and starts to look down to the left, it's a classical signal of a profile of lying, according to psychologists who study this. And this is exactly what Banker Bill said whenever he was asking a question that could provoke a false response based on our red flag theories. We got no eye contact and looking down to the left.
So unfortunately, we didn't have a happy ending to the story.
Although, let me just segue into another part of the story. After we got back and did some more research and investigations, we discovered that in the country called Togo, which is very close by Ivory Coast, a scheme had been conceived of to rent the sort of boxes and boxes of steel boxes of cash from the central bank of Togo in an advance fee fraud scheme that actually took $48 million of money from a businessman in the United Arab Emirates, and that fraud had been, let's say, one of the middlemen in that fraud was a former chief executive officer of the well-known French oil company, ELF. That he got caught up in that scheme, was persuaded that it was authentic, had done some of the same research we had done, had concluded the notes were genuine, and convinced a businessman in Dubai to part with $48 million. Not all at once. All advance fee frauds happen in cycles. They get their claws into you for $1 million, and then the next million, and then the next, and the next. I've seen this in my career over and over again in terms of the psychology of the dance between the fraudster and the victim. In this particular case, the CEO, former CEO of ELF, was actually in Ivory Coast and got extradited and put in a jail in Togo for trying to report what was going on. These were very serious matters. The money sitting in central banks in West Africa, in part, comes from donor nations to the IMF and the World Bank. We reported our findings to the World Bank, to the STAR Initiative. They were deeply concerned with what was happening with boxes of steel boxes containing cash from the central bank. Central banks are not supposed to lend money into the prop of a stage of an advance fee fraud on some kind of systemic basis. So representations have since been made as a result of our work at I understand, the highest of levels between IMF, World Bank, and authorities in these two countries to clean up their act because what is going on should not be happening.
It's a classic bait and switch, and there's also two locations in West Africa where Western donor money is kept. And we believe, we don't know, it hasn't been verified that this money, it probably came from there. So it was a bait and switch, and that's why the guards came along with the money. They didn't mind letting a little bit go. And we were told, and we started to really drill down and be more overt with our inquiries once we realized that we were not going to go through with this scenario. And we found out that we were the second people who were shown the money that day. There were some other punters in there, as the Brits would say, that day. And we probably couldn't see the money until Monday because they had to wait for the bank to open up, or they had to wait for the right guy to be on shift to get the boxes out. The pieces start coming together as you get more information, of course.
So we wanted to put this on not to help asset recovery professionals to know exactly what kind of risks you're facing when working sovereign cases, when assets look like they are real, where we suspected they may be counterfeit and then learned they were genuine, actual assets belonging to someone. And these assets do exist, and they belong to the people of Ivory Coast, but they're being misused in a fraud scheme. I hope that you, are there any questions about our presentation? No? We've hit the hour is 2:30. Thank you very much for your attention.